Previously, we have seen how Grogger struggled while opening the door and how he struggled even to balance his own body. And after that, we have seen how his parents reacted and the chief clerk reacted after seeing him for the first time after being metamorphosized. They were completely astonished because that was completely different view. Grogger was no more a human but an insect. So let's move on to the other part. So now the chief clerk had turned away as soon as Grogger had started to speak, and with protruding lips only stared back at him over his trembling shoulders as he left. He did not keep still for a moment while Grogger was speaking, but moved steadily towards the door without taking his eyes off him. He moved very gradually, as if there had been some secret prohibition on leaving the room. It was only when he had reached the entrance hall that he made a sudden movement, drew his foot from the living room, and rushed forward in a panic. In the hall, he stretched his right hand far out towards the stairway as if out there was some supernatural force waiting to save him. Grogger then realized that it was out of the question to let the chief clerk go away in this mood of his position in the firm was not to be put into extreme danger. There was something his parents did not understand very well. Over the years, they had become convinced that this job would provide for Grogger for his entire life. And besides, they had so much to worry about at present that they had lost sight of any thought for the future. Grogger, though, did think about the future. The chief clerk had to be held back, calmed down, convinced, and finally won over. The future of Grogger and his family depended on it. If only his sister were here. She was clever. She was already in tears while Grogger was still laying peacefully on his back. And the chief clerk was a lover of women. Surely she would persuade him. She would close the front door in the entrance hall and talk him out in the shocked state. But his sister was not there. Grogger would have to do the job himself. And without considering that, he still was not familiar with how well he would move about in his present state, or that his speeches still might not or probably would not be understood. He then let go of the door, pushed himself through the opening, tried to raise the chief clerk on the landing, who, ridiculously, was holding on the banister with both hands. But Grogger fell immediately over and, with a little scream as he sought something to hold on to, landed on his numerous little legs. Hardly had that happened then, for the first time that day, he began to feel all right with his body. The little legs had the solid ground under them. To his pleasure, they did exactly as he told them. They were even making the effort to carry him where he wanted to go. And he was soon believing that all his sorrows would soon be finally at the end. He held back the urge to move, but swayed from side to side as he crouched there on the floor. His mother was not far away in front of him and seemed at first quite engrossed in herself, but then she suddenly jumped up with her arms outstretched and her fingers spread, shouting, "Help! For pity's sake, help!" The way she held her head suggested she wanted to see Grogger better, but the unthinking way she was hurrying backwards showed that she did not. She had forgotten that the table was behind her with all the breakfast things on it. When she reached the table, she sat quickly down on it without knowing what she was doing, without even seeing to notice that the coffee pot had been knocked over and a gush of coffee was pouring down onto the carpet. "Mother, mother," said Grogger gently, looking up at her. He had completely forgotten the chief clerk for the moment, but could not help himself snapping in the air with his jaws at sight of the flow of the coffee. That set his mother screaming anew. She fled from the table and onto the arms of his father as he rushed towards her. Grogger, though, had no time to spare for his parents now. The chief clerk had already reached the stairs. With his chin on the banister, he looked back for the last time. Gregor made a run for him. He wanted to be sure of reaching him. The chief clerk must have expected something as he leaped down several steps at once and disappeared. But now, instead of running after the chief clerk himself, or at least not impeding Gregor as he ran after him, Gregor's father seized the chief clerk's stick in his right hand, picked up a large newspaper from the table with his left, and used them to drive Gregor back into his room, stamping his foot at him as he went. Gregor's appeal to his father were of no help. His appeals were simply not understood. However much he humbly turned his head, his father merely stamped his feet all the harder. Across the room, despite the chilly weather, Gregor's mother had pulled open a window, leaned far out of it, and pressed her hands to her face. A strong draught of air flew in from the street towards the stairway. The curtains flew up, the newspaper on the table fluttered, and some of them were blown onto the floor. Nothing would stop Gregor's father as he drove him back, making hissing noises at him like a wild man. Gregor had never had any practice in moving backwards and was only able to go very slowly. If Gregor had only been allowed to turn round, he would have been back into his room straight away. But he was afraid that if he took the time to do that, his father might become impatient, and there was a high chance that he would get a lethal blow to his back or to his head from his father. Gregor realized that he had no choice as he saw, to his disgust, that he was quite incapable of going backwards in a straight line. So he began so quickly as possible and with frequent anxious glances at his father to turn himself around. It went very slowly, but perhaps his father was able to see his good intention as he did nothing to hinder him. In fact, now and then he used to tip off his stick to give directions from the distance as to which way to turn. So in this way, slowly and steadily, Gregor was able to move back towards his room, since his parents didn't want to see the sight of him. So it was not until it was getting dark that evening that Gregor awoke from his deep and coma-like sleep. He would have woken soon afterwards anyway, even if he hadn't been disturbed, as he had enough sleep and felt fully rested. But he had the impression that some hurried steps and the sound of the door leading onto the front room being carefully shut had woken him. The light from the electric street lamp shone palely here and there onto the ceiling and tops of the furniture, but down below where Gregor was, it was dark. He pushed himself over the door, feeling his was way clumsy with this antenna, of which he was now beginning to learn the value in order to see what had been happening there. The whole of his left side seemed like one painfully stretched scar, and he limped badly on his 2 rows of legs. One of the legs had been badly injured in the events of the morning. It was nearly a miracle that only one of them had been and dragged along lifelessly. It was only when he had reached the door that he realized what it actually was that had drawn him over to it. It was the smell of something to eat. By the door there was a dish filled with sweetened milk with little pieces of white bread floating in it. He was so pleased he almost laughed, as he was even hungrier than he had been that morning, and immediately dipped his head onto the milk, nearly covering his eyes with it. But he soon drew his head back again in disappointment. Not only did the pain in his tender left side make it difficult to eat the food, he was only able to eat if his whole body worked together as a snuffling whole. But the milk did not taste at all nice. Milk, like the was normally his favorite drink, and his sister had certainly left it there for him because of that. But he turned, almost against his own will, away from the dish and crawled back onto the centre of the room. So now it was not only his body that was being metamorphosized, that was changed into insect. But his taste for his food was also changed. So now slowly we can see everything for Gregor was changing. Now, through the crack in the door, Gregor could see that the gas had been lit in the living room. His father at this time would normally be sat with the evening paper, reading it out loud in the voice to the Gregor's mother and sometimes to his sister, but there was now not a sound to be heard. Gregor's sister would often write and tell him about his reading. But maybe his father had lost the habit in recent times. It was so quiet all around too, even though must have been somebody in the flat. What a quiet life it is the family lead, said Gregor to himself, and gazing into the darkness felt a great pride that he was able to provide a life like that in such a nice home for his sister and parents. But what now? If all this peace and wealth and comfort should come to a horrible and frightening end. There was something that Gregor did not want to think about too much. So he started to move about, crawling up and down the room. So once during that long evening, the door on the one side of the room was opened very slightly and hurriedly closed again. Later on, the door on the other side did the same. It seemed that someone needed to enter the room. Gregor went and waited immediately by the door, resolved either to bring the timorous visitor into the room in some way or at least to find out who it was. But the door was opened no more that night and Gregor waited in vain. So it was not until late at night that the gaslight in the living room was put out. And now it was easy to see that his parents and sister had stayed awake all the time, as they all could be distinctly heard as they went away together in tiptoe. It was clear that no one could come into Gregor's room any more until mornings. That gave him plenty of time to think undisturbed about how he would have to rearrange his life. For some reason, the tall, empty room where he was forced to remain made him feel uneasy as he lay there flat on the floor. Even though he had been living in the room for 5 years, hardly aware of what he was doing other than a slight feeling of shame. He hurried onto the couch. It pressed down on his back a little, and he was no longer able to lift his head. But he nonetheless felt immediately at ease, and his only regret was that his body was too bored to get it all underneath. He spent the whole night there. Some of the time he passed in a light sleep, although he frequently woke from it in alarm because of his hunger, and some of the time it was spent in worries and vague hopes, which, however, always led to the same conclusion. For the time being, he must remain calm, he must show patience and the greatest consideration so that his family could bear the unpleasantness that he, in his present condition, was forced to impose onto them. So one day, about a month after Gregor's transformation, when his sister no longer had any particular reason to be shocked at his appearance, she came into the room a little earlier than usual and found him still staring out of the window, motionless and just where he would be most horrible. She went straight back and closed the door behind her. A stranger would have thought he had threatened her and tried to bite her. Gregor went straight to hide himself under the couch, of course, but he had to wait until midday before his sister came back, and she seemed much more uneasy than usual. It made him realize that she still found his appearance unbearable and would continue to do so. She probably even had to overcome the urge to flee when she saw the little bit of him that protruded from under the couch. And for the first 14 days, Gregor's parents could not bring themselves to come into the room to see him. He would often hear them say how they appreciated all the new work his sister was doing, even though before they had seen her as a girl who was somewhat useless and frequently been annoyed with her. But now, the two of them, father and mother, would often both wait outside the door of Gregor's room while his sister tidied up in there. And as soon as she went out again, she would have to tell them exactly how everything looked, what Gregor had eaten, how he had behaved this time, and whether perhaps any slight improvement could be seen. His mother also wanted to go in and visit Gregor relatively soon, but his father and sister at first persuaded her against it. Gregor listened very closely to all this and approved fully. But later, though, she had to be held back by force, which made her call out, "Let me go and see Gregor. He is my fortunate son. Can't you understand? I have to see him." And Gregor would think to himself that maybe it would be better if his mother came in. Not every day, of course, but one day a week. Perhaps she could understand everything much better than his sister, who, for all her courage, was still just a child after all, and really might not have had any adult's appreciation of the burdensome job she had taken so. Gregor's wish to see his mother was soon realized. Out of consideration for his parents, Gregor wanted to avoid being seen at the window during the day. The few square meters of the floor did not give him much room to crawl about. It was hard to just lie quietly through the night. His food soon stopped giving him any pleasure at all, and so, to entertain himself, he got onto the habit of crawling up and down the walls and ceiling. He was especially fond of hanging from the ceiling. It was quite different from laying on the floor. He could breathe more freely. His body had a light swing to it, and up there, relaxed and almost happy. It might happen that he could surprise even himself by letting go of the ceiling and landing on the floor with a crash. But now, of course, he had far better control of his body than before, and even with the fall, and great as that, caused himself no damage. Very soon his sister noticed Gregor's new way of entertaining himself. He had, after all, left traces of the adhesive from his feet as he crawled about, and got into her head to make it as easy as possible for him to removing the furniture that got it his away, especially the chest of drawers and the desk. So now Gregor needed a lot of room to crawl about. So it was decided that some of the furniture needs to be removed from the Gregor's room. But Gregor kept trying to assure himself that nothing unusual is happening. It was just a few pieces of furniture being moved after all. But he soon had to admit that the women going to and fro, their little calls to each other, the scrapping of the furniture on the floor, all these things made him feel as if he were being assailed from all the sides. With his head and legs pulled in against him and his body pressed to the floor, he was forced to admit to himself that he could not stand all of this much longer. They were emptying his room out, taking away everything that was dear to him. They had already taken out the chest containing his fret saw and other tools. Now they threatened to remove the writing desk with its place clearly worn onto the floor. The desk where he had done his homework as a business trainee at high school, even while he had been infant at school. He really could not wait any longer to see whether the two women's intentions were good. So while the women were leaned against the desk in the other room catching their breath, he sallied out, changed direction 4 times, not knowing what he should say first before his attention was suddenly caught by the picture on the wall. He hurried up onto the picture and pressed himself against its glass. It held firmly and felt good in his hot belly. This picture, at least now totally covered by Gregor, would certainly be taken away by no one. He turned his head to face the door onto the living room so that he could watch the women when they come back. They had not allowed themselves a long rest and came back quite soon. Grit had put her arm around her mother and was nearly carrying her. "What shall we take now then?" said Grit, and looked around. Her eyes met those of Gregor on the wall. Perhaps only because her mother was there, she remained calm, bent her face to her so that she would not look around, and said, albeit hurriedly and with a tremor in her voice. Come on, let's go back in the living room for a while. Grugger could see what Greed had in her mind. She wanted to take her mother somewhere safe and then chase him down from the wall. Well, she could certainly try it. He sat unyielding on his picture. He would rather jump at Greed's face. But Greed's words had made her mother quite worried. She stepped to one side, saw the enormous brown patch against the flowers of the wallpaper, and before she even realized it was Grogger that she saw, screamed, "Oh God! Oh God!" Arms outstretched, she fell onto the couch as if she had given up everything and stayed there immobile. "Grogger!" shouted his sister, glowering at him and shaking her fist. That was the first word she had spoken to him directly since his transformation. Then his sister, she ran into the other room to fetch some kind of smelling salts to bring her mother out of her faint. Grogger wanted to help too. He could save his picture later, although he stuck fast to the glass and had to pull himself off by force. Then he too ran on to the next room as if he could advise her sister like in the old days. But he had to just stand behind her doing nothing. She was looking into various bottles. He startled her when she turned around. A bottle fell to the ground and broke. A splinter cut Grogger's face. Some kind of caustic medicine splashed all over him. Now, without delaying any longer, Greed took hold of all the bottles she could and ran with them into her mother. She slammed the door shut with her foot. So now Grogger was shut out from his mother, who because of him might be near to death. He could not open the door if he did not want to chase his sister away. And she had to stay with his mother. There was nothing for him to do but wait, and oppressed with anxiety and self-approach, he began to crawl about. He crawled over everything, walls, furniture, ceiling, and finally, in his confusion, as the whole room began to spin around him, he fell down into the middle of the dinner table. He lay there for a while, numb and immobile. All around him it was quiet. Maybe that was a good sign. Then there was someone at the door. The maid, of course, had locked herself in her kitchen so that Greed would have to go and answer it. His father had arrived home. "What happened?" were his first words. Greed's appearance must have made everything clear to him. She answered him with subdued voice and openly pressed her face onto his chest. "Mother's fainted, but she's better now." Grogger got out. "Just as I expected," said his father. "Just as I always said. But you women wouldn't listen, would you?" Then it was clear to Grogger that Greed had not said enough and that his father took it to mean that something bad had happened and that he was responsible for some act of violence. That meant Grogger would now have to try to come to his father, as he did not have the time to explain things to him even if that had been possible. So he fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it so that his father, when he came in from the hall, could see straight away that Grogger had the best intentions and would go back into his room without delay. That it would not be necessary to drive him back, but that they had only to open the door and he would disappear. Grogger drew his head back from the door and lifted it towards his father. He really had not imagined his father the way he stood there now, of late with his new habit of crawling about. He had neglected to pay attention to what was going on the rest of the flat the way he had done before. He really ought to have expected things to have changed, but still, was that really his father? The same tired man as used to be laying there entombed in his bed when Grogger came back from his business trips, who'd receive him sitting in the armchair in his nightgown when he came back in the evenings. who was hardly even able to stand up, but as a sign of his pleasure, would just raise his arms, and who, on the couple of times a year when they went for a walk together on Sunday or public holiday, wrapped up tightly in his overcoat between Gregor and his mother, would always labor his way forward a little more slowly than them, who were already walking slowly for his shake, who would place his stick to down carefully, and if he wanted to say something, would invariably stop and gather his companions around him. So now Gregor was chased by his father. He had to keep running. So whatever he did, Gregor had to admit that he certainly could not be able to keep up this running about for so long. As for each step his father took, he had to carry out countless movements. He became noticeably short of breath. Even in his earlier life, his lungs had not been very reliable. Then, right beside him, lightly tossed, something flew down and rolled in front of him. It was an apple. Then another one immediately flew at him. Gregor froze in shock. There was no longer any point in running, as his father had decided to bombard him. He had filled his pockets with fruit from the bowl on the sideboard, and now, without even taking the time for careful aim, threw one apple after another. These little red apples rolled about on the floor, knocking into each other as if they had electric motors. An apple thrown without much force glanced against Gregor's back and slid off without doing any harm. But another one, however, immediately following it, hit squarely and lodged in his back. Gregor wanted to drag himself away as if he could remove the surprising, the incredible pain by changing his position. But he felt as if nailed to the spot and spread himself out, all his senses in confusion. The last thing he saw was the door of his room being pulled open. His sister was screaming. His mother ran out in front of her in her blouse. She ran to his father, her skirts unfastened and sliding one after another to the ground. Stumbling over the skirts, she pushed himself to his father, her arms around him, untying herself with him totally. Now Gregor lost his ability to see anything, her hands behind his father's head, begging him to spare Gregor's life. So until now, we have seen how he was chased by his father, his family no more wanted to accept him, his furniture was being assailed. It was like he was no more considered as the member of his family. Even his mother had abandoned him. So let's see what happens in the next part.